Andreas Schleicher is the Director of Education at the OECD, and he's going to tell you all about their Talis survey, which they do on a regular basis, and I won't steal his thunder on that. We are recording this session, and so you should know that for all of those important data protection reasons or something. But we will then be we will edit it and broadcast it at a later date. At the moment, certainly in the UK, it's a very challenging day for a lot of schools as they cope with their first day of closure, but with some children coming in. So we haven't wanted to distract them with broadcasting it live right now, but we will put it out when things have calmed down slightly for people. But we're really pleased to have so many of you join us. And Andreas, over to you.
Thank you, Jim, for hosting the webinar. And indeed, we are launching the results from this latest Talis survey in a world that is so radically different from the time actually when we collected the data back in 2018. In a way, schools are right at the epicenter of the COVID crisis. You know, teachers are facing this right up front. And I still believe that the data provide some very interesting insights into how well our teachers and also our school systems are really prepared to face the pandemic. And in a way, this pandemic doesn't stop and it goes after people regardless of nationality, level of education, income, gender. But that's actually not true for the consequences, which are likely to hit the most vulnerable people first and hardest. And as always, education is no exception to this. Those from privileged backgrounds are going to always find a way around, you know, things like school closures. They find alternative learning opportunities easily. They're going to be supported by their parents, and they understand why studying hard really matters. But those from disadvantaged backgrounds are going to remain shut out if the school shuts down. They may not have access to digital learning resources, or they may lack the resilience or even the engagement to learn on their own, which is what these times require a lot. In some way, this crisis has exposed the many inequities that are sort of inbuilt in our education systems, from the broadband and computers that you need for online education, through the kind of supportive environments that are needed to focus on learning, but also up to our failure to attract the most talented teachers to the most challenging schools and classrooms, and something that the survey results from Talis really highlight. But while those inequalities are magnified in a time of crisis, I think this moment also holds at least promise that we won't return to the inequitable status quo when things get back to normal. It's always going to be our collective and systemic responses to this crisis that are affecting how we are affected by this. And you're going to see some of the results from Talis should give us real hope. But before I talk about the results, let me just highlight a few pointers about Talis. Here you can see it's the largest international survey that brings out the voice of teachers in its original. Covering 48 education systems, increased a lot since we started this work in 2008. So it's the original voice of teachers on issues around work organization, support, student-teacher relationships, and things like this. You can see a map of the countries that are taking part. So you can see it's a pretty good global coverage, and the framework that we use ranges from, you know, the kind of policies and practices to attract great people, how teachers are developed into effective teachers, how they are supported in their daily work, how they are empowered to actually be creative and innovative in the classroom, and last but not least, what education systems do in a view of teachers to retain great teachers. So with this background, how well our schools prepared for this dramatic crisis facing schools and life and people? UNESCO has created a map. Many countries, as you can see, have responded with school closures, either localized or nationwide. And obviously, you know, technology is one of the bridges to close to bridge school closures. And you can say that many schools are now equipped with at least a minimum of technology that is needed for online learning. But you can also see that there's a quarter of school principals in Talis who said that shortage or inadequacy of technology was hindering learning quite a bit or a lot. So again, this is an illustration of the inequality. It's sort of less an issue in the UK, with just 14%. And you can go up to Singapore, it's just 2%. But then you get to France, 30%, Italy, 30%, Vietnam, 80%. And those figures may even understate the real problem, because not every principal might be aware of the opportunities that modern technology provide for instruction. But of course, you know, technology is only as good as it is used. And so according to Talis, just 53% of teachers let their students frequently or always use ICT for projects or classwork. And that varies obviously a lot by country. You know, you have in Denmark or New Zealand, it's 80% or more. And in Finland, Israel, Romania, you can see those numbers have more than doubled over the 5 years leading up to this survey, when we did this last in 2013. So things can be different. And what you can see, that's an area where the UK is pretty much at the lower. Technology seems to be there, but its integration into daily frequent use by teachers is not as prevalent as it is some other countries. And that obviously some indication provides us some indication of to what extent online learning has become natural to students and teachers. And that's obviously what this crisis really, really needs. But you can see here also that compared with other practice, ICT use still ranks quite low. And if you go to the last line on this slide, now, give students projects that require at least 1 week to complete, is only happening, according to teachers, in a sort of less than 30% of classrooms. And again, that's precisely the kind of tasks that in this crisis are now so relevant. Students being able to, you know, work on their own, learn on their own on a sustained kind of basis, supported by their teacher rather than being spoon-fed in a classroom. So this highlights really, even where technology is available, its integration into practice is still far from kind of common. And according to Talis, you can see here also that participation in professional development for teachers is quite strong. You can say 60% of teachers have report that this was, you know, something that happened in the last 12 months. They got some form of training, but you can also see in yellow the needs after, you know, teaching students with special needs. That's the highest, second highest kind of category, where you can see, yes, there's a lot of training going on, but actually many teachers feel that they actually need more and better training to be equipped to use technology appropriately. And again, that's something that pushes us into kind of lots of challenges these days. Younger generations of teachers are better prepared. Now, when you look at the percentage of teachers for whom the use of technology for teaching was included in their formal training, you can see for people who completed their training in the past 5 years, the numbers look generally better. And that's true across the board. You can say basically for all teachers, the UK is still quite well positioned, or England, I must say, because we don't have data for all of the UK. England is positioned better, but when you look at teachers in the last 5 years, most countries are now doing as well as the UK. So younger teachers have an advantage, but also teachers for whom technology was included seem to be making better use out of this, according to Talis. What you can also see, and this is, I think, important, is that where ICT training was included in formal education, you can see teachers are more likely to also use it frequently or always for classwork. So that's a kind of positive indication showing that actually training does seem to make a difference, that teachers get that training, they also are more ready and more frequently using technology in the classroom. But you can also see that teachers have not yet done a lot of online training, the kind of training that probably in this crisis is the only training that will be a reality at the moment. And you can see actually this has traditionally been a lot of courses and seminars for teachers. Professional literature plays, of course, education conferences, But when you look at participation in professional networks and online courses or seminars, that's still quite low. At least that was the situation in 2018. And again, that is precisely the kind of training that probably will matter most in this moment of crisis, now where teachers need to be ready, equipped, and where there needs to be really good material available to connect with teachers. But as always, the heart of good education is never technology. It's really ownership and empowerment. And we've looked into this with Talis quite a bit. You can see that most teachers have some kind of control over their practice, at least in the classroom. It's actually very interesting. Talis suggests that, when it comes to what teachers do in the classroom, there's a pretty good level of involvement, when it comes to the choice of teaching methods. Actually, England less so than other countries. In most countries, teachers have greater degree of control over their teaching methods and also over their teaching content, also assessment of students' learning, discipline, homework, and so on. Course content, again, that's an area where in most countries teachers have a fair degree of control, in England sort of less. But also you can see in only 56% of schools do teachers play a role in school management. So basically this kind of distributed leadership, as we talk about it, is still quite kind of not yet as well established as you might think. But also those things vary quite significantly across countries. Where you can see, for example, here, teachers' autonomy in determining course content in their target class. If you go to Sweden, if you go to Iceland, Norway, Korea, the Netherlands, and so on, basically teachers have almost, most teachers, almost all teachers have pretty much control over what they teach. England here is at the lower end of the spectrum, where you can see that's more kind of prescriptive environment when it comes to course content. And again, if you think about this moment of crisis, you've got to rely on teachers very much to shape their learning environments and the design. It's them who basically are now linking with their students now. And the countries that have faced this crisis first, you look out to China, they have done quite well in establishing and using that social fabric and connecting teachers with their students, empowering teachers more. But again, it requires a pretty high degree of control by this. Now, that's basically control. The innovation part is obviously also important. In this crisis, we all need to be creative. We all need to sort of feel our way. Every day we wake up in a different world, and we have to sort of navigate ambiguity, manage complexity, and be really highly creative and innovative. And this is an area where Talis actually suggests that teachers have a lot more innovation potential than what our bureaucratic industrial school systems sometimes suggest. If you look at these data, you have 4 out of 5 teachers who say they strive to develop new methods and new ideas for teaching. And still, what you can also see when you look at this over day, when you talk about teachers, we ask them, what do you think about the overall climate in your school? What do you think about other teachers? And you can see 80% of teachers on average across countries. I'm always going to talk about averages here unless I mention England specifically. So you can see 80% say most teachers in the school strive to develop new ideas for teaching and learning. Most teachers in the school provide practical support to each other for the application of new ideas. So this professional autonomy and a collaborative culture, very important. And then still sort of close to 80%, most teachers in the school search for new ways to solve problems. And a little less, but still strong, most teachers in the school are open for change. So it seems that actually teachers are ready to be innovative and think also that the environment, at least when it comes to their colleague, is quite innovative. And that also varies across countries. Now you can see in Georgia, Vietnam, Shanghai, very, very strong kind of sense of innovation. And you go to the Flemish community of Belgium, to Portugal, and the French community of Belgium, you can see that is less pronounced. So you can see also there, the attitude towards change and innovation is expressed quite differently across countries. There might be, a little influenced by cultural dispositions in this, but we don't expect this to be the kind of dominant source. You can see, for example, if you go to the Asian context, you find, a system like Shanghai or Vietnam very, very strong on the innovation part, whereas Korea and Japan below the OECD average. So this is not, that Asia is more open to innovation, West is not. You can see that really quite mixed. In the same way, you have, in Europe, you have Bulgaria or Lithuania on the strong side, and then Belgium and Portugal at the lower side. So a lot of variability in the attitudes to innovation, and probably that reflects in some ways the work organization in schools, where schools are more supportive for innovation and not. One thing that Talis also shows that probably there's room for greater reliance on the untapped latent potential and more active support from principals. If you look here, for example, on average, only 59% of school principals take action to support cooperation among teachers to develop new teaching practice. That's obviously very important. If you have a principal, who supports you to be innovative and creative, you're much more likely to have a positive view to innovation and so on. So I think that's an area where the leadership in schools, the work organization, probably be more conducive to innovation. And this is what we need in this crisis. People who are creative designers of innovative learning environments. This is not just about replicating what you do in a classroom on a broadband computer, but it's really about designing new types of learning environments that match the kind of means and technologies that we have today. I mean, teachers are going to confront huge, huge challenges when they move to an online environment. Very different from office workers. For most of us, teleworking is not such a challenge because we do our work in interaction with computers on a daily basis. The kind of processes are aligned. But when you're a teacher, that's a much, much harder challenge. And the biggest challenge is probably about, upholding the social fabric of schools. And the greatest risk in this crisis is perhaps that the social fabric that schools created is going to become fractured. Learning is never a transactional process, where students are passive consumers of content, where schools are service providers, and where parents are clients. Learning always happens through interaction. And it happens always in an environment of well-being and also self-efficacy, both by students and teachers. And the success of students over the coming weeks and months, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds, is going to critically hinge on maintaining this close relationship with their teachers. And that's where technology is not that great. I think we have to find new ways to use technology in ways to maintain that kind of social fabric, the relationship between students and teachers. Now, this is not about broadcasting lessons or putting wonderful digital content on the web. It's really about having each teacher being connected and remain connected with their students. Now, the good side of it is that actually this is exactly what teachers came into teaching for. You see that actually 9 out of 10 teachers said they joined the profession to make a difference to the lives of children. And 3/4 expressly refer to the opportunity to benefit the socially disadvantaged. Now, the kind of social motivation, the relational kind of aspect is a dominant driver of getting people into the profession. So probably we can and should be doing a lot better to support teachers in living that dimension. It is also clear that special needs students will be at a particular risk at this moment of crisis. And again, you can see the shortage of teachers with competence in special needs students is one of the things most critically identified by school leaders as hindering instruction quite a bit or a lot. So this is an area where we had already struggled in 2018 before that crisis, and this crisis is going to amplify it. Now, if you're sort of an average student, probably technology is going to serve you quite well. But if you are a student requiring special support, special assistance, special needs, this crisis is going to make it far more difficult for teachers to reach out to them. Shortage of teachers with competence in multicultural settings. Again, home learning is going to be particularly difficult for students from different language backgrounds. And again, shortage of teachers with competence in disadvantaged students. Again, those students who need that help most in this moment and who are most difficult to reach by online means because they don't have parents who push them and so on. That's going to be, I think, a big, big challenge for all of us. We also see that, again, here, teachers, here you can see the variation by country. But what I really wanted to highlight here is that novice teachers are often more likely to work in the most challenging schools. Now, you would like to see this chart the other way around, where, we send the kind of most experienced teachers to the most challenging schools, students with, good share of students with an immigrant background or from disadvantaged home, but it's exactly the opposite. And that is true. You have in England great devices like the pupil premium, getting more resources to students who need more help. But when it comes to the experience of teachers, it still goes the other way around. Now, it's true in the OECD area. It's true in very few countries that have been able to attract resources with needs. And once again, in this moment of crisis, this is going to be amplified. It's not only that it's tougher, you can also see that novice teachers get less mentoring. That's a bit better in England than it is in many other countries, but still, we're only talking about less than 40% of teachers who have an assigned mentor as part of a formal arrangement. And then when you get to experienced teachers, those numbers get very, very low, below 10%. In a way, what we can learn from high-performing systems. Now you can see, for example, number one here is Shanghai in China. It's true for basically every teacher coming into the profession that they get the support by experienced teachers. And also every teacher will be a mentor to other teachers. So this culture of mutual support is very much pronounced in countries on the left side. Also Singapore, a good example, Kazakhstan, and so on, New Zealand, but it's lacking in a vast majority of countries. And once again, in a school, you can ask, friends and colleagues, in an environment where you have to support, students during school closures, being connected to your colleagues, being sort of integrated in a culture of professional learning communities and development is so much more important. And it's something that is something, even in peace times, 2018, we haven't seen as much of this as you might want. So this brings me to another point where Talis looks in detail at what do teachers think about the collaborative culture in schools. First of all, when it comes to informal exchange and collaboration, you can see that's quite common. 61% of teachers discuss development of students with colleagues quite regularly. At least almost half say frequently that they exchange teaching materials. So the kind of informal collaboration works quite well. But what you can see is that team teaching is still very kind of limited. And that's something, working together as a team to teach across the boundaries of disciplines. And more importantly, only 9% of teachers say they routinely observe colleagues and give feedback. So this deeper layer of professional collaboration is still quite rare. Why do I emphasize this? Because our data from Talis show that this is the most important driver of teacher self-efficacy. It's not the informal exchanges, but it's the deeper layers of professional collaboration that are still quite rare. And you can see it varies across countries a lot. Teachers, team teaching, you can see countries like Austria and Italy, Japan have made that quite common. In England, it is not very common. Classroom observation also, you can see some systems, very, very kind of strong culture of classroom observation is happening every day. In the UK is still less than 16, 17%. Participation in professional collaborative learning, that's a little bit better, but still is only a minority. I think in this moment of crisis, we'll have to look at this in much, much more nuanced ways. And why do I say this? Because we also see in the data that the adoption of effective teaching practices and professional collaboration go hand in hand. You can see, for example, here, how much more likely are people to use cognitive activation practices that we know lead to better learning outcomes that is quite strongly correlated with the collaborative culture in the school. Now, probably, if I observe this in my teachers, discuss it with my teachers, I become better at using this. If other people observe me, provide feedback with me, I will become better in those kinds of things. So the professional culture actually relates to a number of very important teaching practices and their use and application in the classroom. I mentioned some challenges among schools, teachers. You can see the same among principals. actually, when you look at the share of principals who often or very often engage in collaboration with principals from other schools, you can see it's a minority. In the UK, you talk about 30%. Even in the top performers, it's a little bit more than 60%. So I think that is a big challenge that we face, to build a more collaborative culture also in the school, where the school system is not sort of so atomistic, but engages schools to work actually more effectively with each other. In this moment of crisis, sharing ideas, resources among the schools is going to be so much more important. The best education minister cannot address the needs of tens of thousands of schools and hundreds of thousands or millions of students and teachers. I think it's really the time where the school system, the fabric of the school system, needs also to create a more collaborative culture, and we're quite far away from this. Reducing pressure on teachers. Now, what are the sources of pressure and stress? It's actually very interesting. When you look on the horizontal axis, the number of hours that have been spent during the most recent calendar week doing a specific task, and then on the vertical axis, the stress that teachers experience. You can see, more teaching leads to greater pressure. But that relationship is actually not that strong. Across countries, we don't see that much of a relationship between the number of hours teachers teach and the pressure they perceive. But when you look at tasks that our teachers perceive to be outside the classroom, you can see that relationship becoming steeper. Now, individual planning or preparation of lessons, the relationship between volume and stress gets higher. Correcting students' work, the line gets even steeper. And last but not least, administrative work, things that teachers don't see so much meaning in, and that is sort of really foreign to the mission they feel to have as teachers. This is the big driver of stress. Even, you add 1 hour of this and you can get, quite an important increase in the perceived level of stress. So if we want, create an environment where teachers work more comfortable, it is not so much about the work with the students, but all this extraneous work that actually seems to be a problem. At least, these are perceptions of teachers. It's very, very hard to judge them from the outside, but that's, what teachers say, and it's quite consistent across countries. And again, in this moment of crisis, there is a risk that we are going to increase the kind of administrative and bureaucratic work, particularly in systems that lack trust in teachers and schools. There's a risk that we are going to create even more bureaucratic and administrative layers of accountability in a system where sort of schools are more sort of less rely on the physical presence. So this, I think, is a chat we should take to heart. Now, let me conclude the presentation with one thing that I think is really, really important. I think in this is a moment of the crisis, we all cheer the health workers. They do an amazing job in very, very difficult, challenging conditions in the hospitals. But that's true for teachers as well, who are, doing everything they can to support students in this difficult moment. And what you can actually see is that is not reflected in their professional status or in the value that teachers see they have in society. Only 26% of teachers feel that they are valued by societies. That's something I think that should give us to think in these days, what we can do to ensure that our teachers get the appreciation that they need for their work. And this is not just about pay. Actually, the relationship between this dimension and pay is only modest. It has a lot more to do with the kind of jobs and careers that our systems offer and how people talk about the teaching profession. And again, it's something that varies enormously across countries. Now, if you're in Vietnam or Singapore or the United Arab Emirates or Korea, you don't worry about this. Basically, most teachers feel that their work is valued by society. But if you are in France and Slovenia and the French community of Belgium, Slovak Republic, it's a tiny minority of teachers who perceive that the work they do every day, the hard work they do every day, is appreciated by society. Also, England has, I think, a lot of room to improve. If you think it's just 30 30% actually, and it is lower than it was when we did the same survey 5 years ago. And that's true in a number of countries as well. You could look at New Zealand, which where the status of the teaching profession used to be better, or the Flemish community of Belgium, or Chile, where it has plummeted really in relative terms. But then there are also some good signs. You can see, for example, here in Canada, the province of Alberta in Canada, it seems that things look better in 2018 than in 2013, or Shanghai in China, also at the top and even improving. So I think there are some, Estonia, there are some good examples, but again, overall, I think this is something that in this moment of crisis should give us to think. These teachers are going to be the engineers of the dreams of our children and the future of our countries, and I think there's more that society can do to support them. With this, I want to stop so that we have enough time for your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas. That was fascinating. There's so much there to explore. Now, I want to open it up to questions. There's two ways of asking Andreas questions. The first is you can raise your hand with the hand raising function, and John Bangs has already led the way, so he gets the first question through that mechanism. And the other is to post a question through the Q&A button that you should also be able to see. And Rafe Lucas has asked the first question there, so I'll come to him second. But first of all, let me go to John Bangs. I'm allowing you to talk now, John.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, well, first of all, Andreas, can I say hi to Jim as well? I haven't seen you for a bit. Can I congratulate you on the Talis report? I think it's the best of the 3 Talis reports that have been produced. And my first question really is, you've got a record 47 policy pointers in the report. I mean, it seems to me that what they are is the framework for any good teacher policy for an education system, obviously not off the shelf, but I'd like you to comment on that. I think your comments on the crisis are absolutely right, and your anxiety about the fracturing of school communities, I think, is absolutely right. But it does seem to me that one of the most hopeful and inspiring things about Talis is your focus on the relationship between teacher leadership and self-efficacy of teachers. And it does seem to me, through all sorts of platforms, including WhatsApp, that the head teacher, who is the domineering autocrat, can't actually, in this crisis, continue. They have to rely on the innovation of their teachers. And I think creative distributed leadership using all sorts of innovative ideas, whether it's WhatsApp or whatever platform, to actually involve the community and teachers is an opportunity. So I'd like you to comment on that. And finally, the stress questions and the well-being questions in Talis are new. And Education International, of which I'm representing, has argued very strongly for those questions. The dismaying thing, I'd like you to comment on this, is that no country has yet taken up the offer from the OECD that there should be a special project on the relationship between teacher well-being and student achievement. And I'd like you to comment on perhaps why that is the case and whether there's any hope for that kind of work in the future. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you very much, John. So 3 questions. As ever, John chancing his arm, but Andreas, over to you.
Yeah, John, if I had written the policy pointers, after the crisis, we might have actually prioritized quite differently. And let me try that. If I would, look at what is most important in this moment, I think things that can strengthen both professional autonomy and the collaborative culture in school. I think this is really what is most urgent at this point. Technology is going to be very important to reach out to connect students. Perhaps more emphasis on connecting teachers. I think now we all rely on digital means to communicate, to collaborate, and this is something where you can see from the data that's not yet a culture. Teacher training is not as much drawing on facilities to share good practices, good ideas among the teaching profession. In a way, this is also an opportunity for education to become more lateral and less vertical in its means of organization. And we have still a very industrial approach to organizing education, and perhaps this crisis is a moment to build stronger horizontal links among teachers using technology. But for me, that would be sort of, if I had to make a choice today, rewriting this book after this crisis, what we can do to strengthen professional autonomy, like giving teachers greater empowerment, creating a more innovative support system for teachers. That's something, look at this data, particularly from principals. John, you highlighted it as well. It doesn't seem to come as much support. And on the one hand, you can say teachers in England, have a lot of discretion when it comes to, deciding how to work, but actually very little insights and very little kind of engagement and involvement in the what question. And I think in a time in which we live, probably we'll have to rely more on teachers' judgment and, what do I teach in this moment to what student? So I think that's a kind of big issue. And that was also on the innovation part. The point about stress, indeed, we wanted to undertake a special study on this, because identifying the sources of stress is going to be vital to find good remedies for this. Now, as I showed you in that one slide, it's not just about reducing teaching hours. In fact, teaching hours doesn't seem to be the big driver of stress. It's sort of pushing teachers to do things that have little to do with why they became teacher, namely to make a difference to the lives of students and learners. That seems to be the real drivers of stress. So understanding this is a kind of means to finding effective ways and having the voice of teachers in this. Now, people talk a lot about teacher stress and teacher work, but actually we do very little to find out, what teachers themselves think about those things. And that was a means, as you say, it's disappointing that very few countries expressed an interest in this. I hope that they will have second thoughts. This is the moment where everybody will rely on teachers.
Thank you. Now I've unmuted Rafe Lucas. Rafe, if you want to ask the question that you've also posted in the Q&A, that would be great. And then I'll come to Alison Peacock, and after that, David Putnam.
Jim, thank you very much. Andreas, I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you very much. I just wanted to know what the sample size is in individual countries. In other words, some indication of how big the error bars are when we're comparing two countries, and also whether there's anything in this report which sheds light on how good practice should move between schools, how it should be evaluated and accepted.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. The sample sizes vary across countries depending on various factors, but we have 260,000 teachers surveyed in the 48 countries in 50,000 schools. So as you can see from this, it's a very decent number of teachers. It's the largest survey that exists, and that is up from 70,000 teachers in 2008. So with 260,000 teachers in 48 countries, you get a pretty good kind of picture that is granular enough. In my charts, whenever the relationships were not statistically significant, I didn't say that, but the bars are sort of gray, or the figures were gray. Whenever they were in darker tone, you can rely on those differences also be statistically significant. The report actually devotes a lot of material to collaboration among teachers, collaboration among schools. That's been a really, really big topic for us, because we see this in the data to be one of the key drivers of teacher self-efficacy. You can see where teachers teach more as a team, where they get more, classroom observation and get feedback on this, where they engage more in professional collaboration. You can see actually self-efficacy of teachers goes up. We do not understand necessarily the causal relationship, causal nature of that relationship, but I do think that kind of link is very important. The professional culture of collaboration is a key ingredient for self-efficacy in some way of teaching. And it is also, I think, a good kind of indicator how well our systems are prepared for this moment of crisis. This moment, you cannot rely on the kind of standard kind of streams of information. You need to rely more on people reaching out to their neighbors rather than, reaching upwards to their school leader. And I think that's something, I think it's a great indication how well our systems are prepared. It is also a great strength of, some high-performing education systems in PISA. You look to Estonia, you look to Finland in Europe, or you look to, Hong Kong, you look to Japan, you look to China in Asia. That is their big strengths. That actually, or Singapore, they have very strong professional learning communities among teachers. They have very strong digital means for teachers to share and co-create lesson plans and practices. That is in Japan. Every teacher participates in lesson studies, so that is quite natural for them. Now they are embedded in a strong profession rather than working in isolation in a classroom. I do think that's an area where we can really learn from. If you go to Europe, Finland and Estonia, the most amazing number is that only about 5-6% of performance variation of PISA lies between schools. No? The closest school is always the best school in those countries. No? And I think in this moment of crisis, coherence in the system, not, forgetting about the most marginalized schools and students, but keeping everybody on the radar screen in an environment where you can't, keep them together physically is going to be particularly important. So I think collaboration, equity, our capacity to align resources with needs, those are going to be critical determinants in this moment.
Thank you very much. Now, Alison Peacock from the Chartered College of Teaching.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Thank you for your presentation. It's fascinating. A lot of what we're trying to do at the Chartered College is all about building professional communities and collaboration. But at this moment of crisis, as you say, the idea that teachers came into this job to make a difference, we were seeing so many people wanting to help. And I think one of the really crucial things we will need to do at the centre across the country is to show people what they can contribute, how they can help, because it does make one feel better if you feel that you're doing something. So thank you, and we will try our best to help people contribute.
Yeah, I think the knowledge mobilizers and the knowledge sharers in this moment are going to be really the linchpin of any education system. Those who can actually find the good ideas, share them, spread them. Now, I think that is something I think you're going to play a very, very central role.
Thank you. And now to David Putnam, who has a specific question around the OU. And then after that, I'll come to Tim Brinkhouse.
Thanks, Jim. Andreas, that was terrific. I made dozens of notes, but I'll restrict myself really to one question, which is in a sense of frustration. In the UK, we've got now 50 years of experience of the Open University and the way it can operate. Surely this is a fantastic opportunity to extend that form of learning out into secondary and primary settings. And it seems odd to me that I've read nothing at all in the last couple of weeks where these school closures have been all but inevitable. Nothing at all that indicates to me that governments are collaborating or organizing themselves along those lines and using that example as a way forward.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's not only that we need to do this, it's also that we can do this. As you say, the Open University is an example that has a well-established kind of infrastructure and the means and the methods to do this, because it's also clear you can't just extrapolate from a traditional classroom to broadcast it digitally. You need to change your approach to teaching, and that's something that you in the Open University has done. But I must say, actually, some countries have been very, very quick on this. China was struck first by this crisis, obviously, and a month later, on the 17th of February, they had a platform connecting 50 million learners through digital means, and what I think was also great, and very similar to your work in the Open University, this wasn't about mass communication or broadcasting. It was really about connecting individual teachers with students to rebuild that social fabric digitally, very much like the spirit of the Open University. So we need to do this, and we can do this. I really think also there has been very little attention to this in many countries. We're so stuck in the kind of brick and mortar culture of education, the kind of very atomistic kind of way of building schools, that I think it's still, a big culture change that is needed. But if anything positive can come out of this crisis, I think is that it will push us to make that transition and to think more openly about, learning is not a place, learning is an activity. And I think we can actually take that more serious in this moment.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you. And then before I bring Tim in, just to say, if you want to raise a question, if you want to ask a question, do click on the raise hand button or type it into the Q&A, which is exactly how Tim has asked his question. So Tim, over to you.
Thanks very much. I thoroughly enjoyed what I heard.
Oh, sorry. I clicked the wrong button. Hang on. Tim, I'll bring you back. I've just got to find you again. There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Sorry, that was my fault.
Well, there are 2 points after that excellent presentation, which I'd like to raise. The first is long term, which is to remind those listening that Judith Little, the American, old now, but an American researcher, said you knew you were in a good school or a department where 4 things happened. Teachers talk about teaching, teachers observe each other's practice, teachers plan and organize and evaluate together rather than separately, and teachers teach each other. And it seems to me that in the long term, the more we can encourage that to happen, particularly in the light of what Andreas was revealing in his statistics about planning together, etc., the better things will be. On the immediate and the crisis we're in, I'm puzzled by the UK's response, which doesn't seem very coherent. I would have thought it would be a good idea to challenge schools which remain open, not to kind of dismiss the national curriculum, but to be creative together about a curriculum that suited, in particular, opening the minds and touching the hearts of the youngsters who are falling behind. Because the Rothstein research shows that in America, I think I'm right in saying, the gaps between those who succeed and are privileged and those who don't succeed are underprivileged increases between June and September, but the schools hold it between September and June. And now we're going to have an enforced period of absence. It seems to me the prospects, as Andreas was saying, for the least stable and the least privileged are awful. And all schools ought to be focusing on what we can do about that, including real attendance and tutorials.
Yeah, on your first point, actually, the 4 drivers that you mentioned line up really well with also the Talis data show. When you look at, classroom observation, feedback, appraisal, mutual appraisal, collaborative professional learning, all of those things are really the principal, predictors of self-efficacy among teachers. And also some of them, teacher collaboration is also a predictor for greater use of high-end pedagogical practice, like cognitive activation. Are you going to sort of create that moment where students really are highly attentive and aware? So basically, that lines really, really well. That's something that our data shows, even though it's just a correlation and necessarily a causal relationship. But the second point, or the last point that you raised, I think is very, very important as well. We should be quite cognizant that this crisis risks to amplify social disparities. Many people ask, how can we know this? But exactly the kind of analysis that you have done is also what we have done, looking at what periods of school vacation, when they are long, does to social disparities. And you can see everywhere that basically those vacation periods are where those gaps open. It's not so difficult to understand. Students from wealthy background, get parents pushing them. You've got to study hard. They get all the support, all the means, all the extra lessons. And students from disadvantaged backgrounds, even if they have access to online resources, that's probably not going to be so much the issue, at least in our part of the world. But you need the motivation. You need to have people who bring you along on this journey, who support you, who make you understand that studying hard actually matters. And I think that's the part where really we need to invest to ensure that we do not end up with a even more inequitable education system than what is currently in place.
Thank you, Andreas, and thank you, Tim. I don't have any more questions coming from anybody else, but I do have a question, and so I will ask it, and Andreas will answer. And then if nobody else has asked a question, then we'll wrap up. But feel free to use the Q&A and the raise hands if you want to ask anything else, because we do have a bit more time. Andreas, you've written a blog which we'll be publishing today on TES about Talis and COVID-19. And in it, you talked about the experience in China. And obviously, we are all looking at China, looking as if they're coming out of certainly the initial wave of infection and starting to be able to return to something like normality. But they use tech, ICT, and remote learning quite a lot during the period of lockdown. What lessons can we learn from what China has done?
Several things. I think first of all, it's important to react quickly. Once the social fabric, the connections between students and teachers get lost, it's going to be harder and harder to rebuild that. So they did that. The first thing that impressed me really was that schools were given the highest priority when the financial, situation became very difficult. So they didn't, save on their schools. They redoubled their investment. They were also very good in mobilizing public-private partnerships. Now, the tech platform that I mentioned, getting, 7,000 servers aligned, 90 terabyte of bandwidth, this is a massive technical challenge. And actually they got, tech companies very closely involved. And this is part of the problem that we face today. Why is the state of digital, infrastructure in schools and digital resources so poor? Is because for tech companies, that's not an interesting market. Your children wouldn't play with much of the educational software that we dump on schools. So anyway, that's what they did. They got the government and private sector working together very, very rapidly, and then within a month put together this platform. The third thing I think we can learn from is that it's not just about online dissemination of knowledge. They also took great care to use the platform to connect individual teachers with their students. So it was not just the government pushing the curriculum out through a different channel, but actually the idea was really to rebuild the relationship between students and teachers and student groups so that this learning remained interactive and teachers could really follow learning progressions of individual students. It's difficult to assess how well this is working in every part, but the system as such was designed to do that. So not just, open educational resources, but also a very interactive relationship that brought, teachers and students along. And the last point is about, not forgetting those who have access difficulties. Basically, they also printed traditional material and actually mailed them to the homes of students who didn't have access to computers. And that's also something, the first digital divide in access is still real for some households, and actually they built that into their strategy. But in a nutshell, it's about massive investments at the beginning. It's about bringing the private sector on board in a coordinated fashion, and then to ensure that this is something that actually teachers are well prepared and engaged in using. I mean, in a way, they had an advantage because also before, teachers are quite used to technology in the classroom, so that was not something, a big culture change. But in this moment, every teacher got a bit trained, every teacher got aware, and in this initial months of school closure, they worked very, very hard on this kind of training aspect. But I think it's an illustration actually what is possible to be done. And you can see, Singapore, Korea actually on a similar path, putting together very, very good kind of infrastructure for all of this.
Thank you. And Fei Deng is a university teacher in Macau, and she wants to contribute. Over to you, Fei. Unmute.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Can you hear me? Sorry, I'm not sure if my mic works.
Yeah, no, we can hear you really well, Fei.
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, actually, I'm really surprised that in the comments saying that China has taken a very good method to combat the virus this time. But my real issue is that I can't ask all my because I'm teaching a language class. It's very difficult for me to run an online course like before. to ask all of my students to contribute in the class. I wonder how would a Western style of language class look like online?
Well, I think actually what you describe is actually the perfect example how things should be. This is about co-creation. Use the technology to actually work with your student to co-create the content and the structure of the lessons. And obviously that's something that you seem to be quite familiar with already. And I wish, more teachers would, use this moment to develop similar approaches. I think the risk is simply that we use off-the-shelf kind of online solutions of, very passive consumer-based learning among students, and that's not going to reach every student. That will particularly penalize those students who don't have the motivation and the native self-regulation to actually use those resources.
That's quite true. Thank you.
Thank you, Faye. And then I have an anonymous question, which is, in the UK, we are embedding a new early career framework across schools, with newer teachers enjoying the benefit of mentors and more up-to-date training, for example, in tech. What can we learn from this most recent Talis report for shaping the ongoing learning and support of our more experienced teachers?
Yeah, I think this is a very, very important part of a strong education system these days. Not just to have strong initial teacher training before teachers get into schools, but to give them really access to the most experienced teachers in the schools through mentoring. So I think the England is on a very good track with this. And as you could see also in the Talis data, the numbers in England look quite positive in the sense that at least novice teachers get a lot of mentoring. Not as much as in some of the countries in East Asia. Now there, basically those numbers are more than doubled. So there's still, I think, progress to be made, but I think the approach is the right one. But at the same time, it's maybe not enough to limit this just to novice teachers. So I think in a modern education system, you would want every teacher to be a mentee and every teacher to be a mentor, to have a really strong kind of lifelong, life-wide learning experience. If your students will not become lifelong learners if your teachers are not also lifelong learners. And I think providing better support and facilitation for this, I think is going to be critically important, particularly in a moment of crisis like this, where, a lot of teachers are going to be struggling.
Thank you. I think that is all of our questions. And some people need to go off for 11 o'clock meetings. So I think it's a good time to wrap up. Andreas, we're hugely grateful. I've been asked by David to circulate the blog. So once it's live, assuming that we've collected with consent the email addresses of all the participants, we will email a link to the blog, and we might even be able to email a link to the recording of the session for those that want to go back and have a look at some of the slides that you were sharing earlier on. But it's been fascinating. I hugely applaud the work that you're doing, Andreas, and in particular the insights that we've had today from you and from the Talis survey. And at this difficult time of crisis, some of those lessons and reflections of best practice, I think, are invaluable. We're very grateful, and we look forward to doing more of this as and when it's appropriate and we've got something useful to say. But thank you very much.
Thanks so much for hosting us, Tim. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Always
all the
a
best.
pleasure to
Bye-bye.
collaborate with you.